Hello everybody. So let's talk about chord substitutions. So in a jazz or blues style, you are frequently going to see some chords that go beyond the basic progression just to kind of spice things up. So there's basically two categories that we're going to talk about right now. One of them is tonicization, which we've heard that word before. We've talked about that word many times, having to do with secondary dominants and leading tone chords. And the other thing is kind of a new concept, and that is the tritone substitution. So before we talk about these two different things, just this top progression right here is what we're starting from. Here's a basic circle progression. Usually we would not see the seventh chords on it, but if you think about, a very typical sequence, even in box time, would be something like a 1 chord, and then a 4 chord, and then a 7, and then a 3, and then a 6, and then a 2, and then a 5, and then a 1. So I've got these labeled here with their Roman numerals. If I make them all seventh chords, it sounds a little juicier. Okay, so I'm just adding on the seventh that is in the key of C. So some of them are major sevenths, some of them are half diminished, some of them are minor sevenths, right? And of course the only dominant one we have is the G7 or the 5. So that is a basic diatonic progression. But what usually tends to happen is that we will see, especially in the turnaround, which is kind of the end of the phrase leading back. We've talked about the turnaround before. It's a progression that leads you back to the tonic, and frequently it becomes this chain of secondary dominants. So now instead of just a normal, say, 6-7 chord followed by a 3-7 chord followed by a 5-7 or a 2-7 followed by a 5-7, we get everything as a dominant. And so here's our 1 chord. This is the 5 of the 1, but then the D7 is the 5 of the 5. And the A7 is the 5 of the 2. And so we get this chain, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up the little play button here so we can play it. I'm going to play from the beginning so you can hear the difference between the diatonic progression and then the one with the added dominant seventh chords. Okay, so you can hear that it has a little bit of more momentum, and it sounds a little bit brighter going toward the end of the phrase. And these chord voicings are horrible, by the way. I just did like block seventh chords so you can see them. But if you look in your book on pages 564 to 570, the chords that they use for their examples are spaced out in this beautiful 4-part voicing. But for now, just to kind of understand the harmonic progression, I think it actually helps just to see them jump around. So they're moving by fourths. Okay, so basically tonicization is that you are adding, you're turning everything into a dominant, and it occasionally involves adding the 2 before the dominant. So we talked about 2-5 progressions a while ago. Instead of maybe just the A7, you would see a 2-5. So if this is the 5 of the D, you would also see an E minor before that. So you might see these little pockets, or you might see a chain like this of E7 to A7 to D7 to G7. And those are tonicizations. Now, the tritone substitution is kind of an interesting thing, because if you think about it, we talked about in a dominant seventh chord, say G, B, D, F, we have these two notes, B and F, that are what we call the tonicizing tritone, right? So these notes want to resolve in to C and E, right? But if we kind of flip those two notes and think about them not as, in this chord they would be sol, ti, re, fa. Now that we've done set theory, we know that this is interval class 6, which is the same upside down and backwards. So if we did F and B up this way, and the F became the T, and the B became the Fa, we would get a totally different chord, which is D flat, F, A flat, C flat, which is a dominant 7th chord, a tritone away from where we started. Right, and they both have these two notes. So noticing that these two chords were kind of had a similar sound, jazz musicians started swapping them out. And so what happens when you do that is you can create some really neat chromatic bass lines that have kind of a similar function to this chain of dominant 7ths. So I'm going to scroll down so I can show you what that entails. So here again I have the same beginning of my progression, and I get to my E7 chord, but then instead of going from E7 to A7, we use the tritone substitution for A7, which is E flat 7. So it's dominant 7th chord, a tritone away. And then we do our normal thing that we were going to do, D7, and then we do the tritone substitution for G7, and then we land on 1. And so what we get for our bass line, instead of this one up here, we get this. Right, so it's a little bit more smooth in terms of the melodic movement in the bass. It has a similar function, but it also has this kind of cool chromatic descending sound to it. So let's go ahead and play. I'm going to play the straight up tonicized version into the tritone sub version. Okay, so you can hear how it just kind of like floats, descends down to the 1 and lands. So that's one option for a tritone substitution. Basically, any of these chords could have a tritone sub on them. If you did them all, though, they would have a similarly jumpy bass line. But if you decided to, instead of substituting this chord and this chord, you did this one and this one, you would get this. And so you would get, so I could get this any higher. There we go. Okay, so this is basically the same progression, except instead of doing the tritone sub for these two chords, I did them for these two, and that gives you a bass line of so this progression would retain our classic 5-1 at the end, but the chromatic bass line would start from the B, go down to the 5, and then up. So let's listen to that. Okay, so that's tonicization and tritone subs in a nutshell. So when you are asked to provide a tritone sub, we'll look at the specifics of your homework, but uh, it's basically just a dominant seventh chord, a tritone away. That's all it is. It's kind of weird though to think about, just because a tritone seems like it's really far away, and why would you do that? But hopefully it makes sense that the sound is similar with that tonicizing tritone. And it just gives a little bit more flavor to the harmonic progression, gives you a little bit of a variety in the sound.